Officer James Harrington slid into his patrol car with the familiar creak of the worn leather seat beneath him. The radio hummed with the usual static chatter as he adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his own reflection. He liked what he saw. A man in uniform, a man with authority. He was no longer the rookie who had fumbled with paperwork or second-guessed his every decision. He was seasoned, hardened by years of service in one of the toughest cities in the country. It was late morning, and the sun shone brightly on the wide streets of the wealthier part of the city. James wasn't assigned to this district, but his own beat had been quiet. But noise complaints and the occasional traffic stop. He figured he could take a detour. After all, who was going to question him? He had free rein, and if there was one thing James was sure of, it was that no one questioned his authority. Not anymore. His wife Sarah used to, but that had changed long ago. Now their conversations were reduced to curt exchanges over dinner and the awkward silence of a shared living space that had lost its warmth. Their marriage was a shell of what it had once been. James knew why but refused to admit it to himself. Claire Matthews, the wife of one of his colleagues, had filled the emotional gap Sarah left behind. At first it was exciting, intoxicating even, but now it felt more like a burden, a secret too heavy to carry, but too dangerous to let go. As he turned a corner into the upscale Pine Hills neighborhood, his eyes were drawn to a sleek black sedan speeding slightly over the limit. It wasn't anything serious, nothing that warranted more than a warning, but something about the car caught his attention. Maybe it was the flashiness of it, the way it gleamed in the sunlight. Or maybe it was the neighborhood itself, where expensive cars were common, but something felt out of place. Without hesitation, James flipped on his lights and pulled the car over. The car slowed to a stop at the curb. As James approached, he caught sight of the driver through the tinted window. A woman, Rachel Walker, elegantly dressed, her face serene and calm. She was black. James couldn't help the immediate judgment that flashed through his mind. He felt a rush of superiority, a sense of control that he had come to relish over the years. Rachel lowered her window as James knocked harder than necessary. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone sharp and dismissive. Rachel handed over her documents without a word. Her hands didn't tremble, which was unusual. Most people were at least a little nervous during a traffic stop, especially in this part of town, and especially when confronted by an officer like James. "You know why I pulled you over?" James asked, looking over the documents more thoroughly than was needed. "I'm not sure," Rachel replied, her voice calm and controlled. "I wasn't speeding." Her composure unnerved him. He was used to people showing fear, to seeing them stammer and fumble in front of him. This woman, however, was unfazed. James could feel his control over the situation slipping, and it irritated him. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice laced with insinuation. "Nice car. You sure it's yours?" Rachel didn't flinch. "Yes, I'm sure. I bought it with my money." There was a silent challenge in her words, one that James wasn't prepared for. He had expected submission, fear, but instead she remained firm. He scanned the documents, searching for any small mistake to give him a reason to prolong the stop, to regain control of the situation. But everything was in order. He decided to change tactics. "You live around here?" he asked, giving the car another once-over. "Seems like you're a bit out of place." Rachel turned slightly, pointing ahead. "My house is just down that street. I've lived here for 3 years. James hesitated. He had no reason to continue the stop, no legitimate grounds to issue a citation. Yet his frustration over her calm demeanor pushed him to persist. "You know," he said, leaning closer to the window, "people like you don't usually drive around here in something like this. Maybe you're doing something you shouldn't be." Rachel's brow furrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "People like me?" she repeated. "And what exactly does that mean, officer?" James straightened up, smirking slightly as he took a step back. "You know exactly what it means." Rachel looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "I'm heading home, officer. There's no reason for this stop to continue." Her words cut through the air, challenging the very power he wielded. She was right, and they both knew it. Yet James wasn't ready to let her go. "Where do you work?" he asked. "Maybe I can call your employer and check if you're telling the truth." "I'm an attorney," Rachel said simply. "I work at Benson and Gray on Main Street." James felt his confidence falter for the first time. Benson and Gray was one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. This woman was more than what he had assumed, and it bothered him. Before he could speak, Rachel continued, her voice firm but polite. "If you're finished, officer, I'd like to be on my way." The silence stretched between them, and James felt a rising anger he couldn't quite place. But he knew the stop had gone too far. "Fine," he muttered, handing her back the documents. "But keep an eye out. We'll be watching you." Rachel took her documents without another word, started the car, and smoothly pulled away from the curb. James watched as the black sedan disappeared down the street, the sense of power he usually felt during these encounters slipping away from him entirely. Back at the station, James sat at his desk, replaying the encounter in his mind. Something about that woman, Rachel, had unsettled him. She had challenged him without raising her voice, without showing fear. Her calm had disarmed him in a way that made him feel exposed. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Captain Jonathan Reed, his new boss, calling him into his office. James's heart sank. Reed was known for being strict but fair, a man with a reputation for maintaining order. James had never interacted with him much, but he had heard stories of how Reed dealt with officers who stepped out of line. As James made his way to Reed's office, the knot in his stomach tightened. He hadn't done anything outright illegal during the stop, but he knew that his behavior had been inappropriate. It was the kind of stop that might have gone unnoticed before, but with Reed in charge, things were different. Reed sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable as James entered. "Close the door," Reed said, his voice calm but authoritative. James obeyed, feeling the tension in the room rise as he stood before the captain's desk. "Yesterday, you made a stop in Pine Hills," Reed began, his tone measured. "A black sedan, female driver. Do you remember?" James nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Yes, sir. It was a routine stop." Reed leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving James. "The driver has filed a complaint," he said evenly. "She described the stop as unnecessary and racially motivated. She claims you humiliated her, questioned her ownership of the vehicle, and insinuated she didn't belong in the neighborhood." James opened his mouth to speak, but Reed raised a hand, stopping him. "I don't tolerate abuse of power in my department, Harrington," Reed continued, his voice firm. "This is your only warning. I will be watching you closely from now on." James felt his stomach drop. This was no ordinary reprimand. Reed's words carried the weight of something much more serious, and for the first time in a long time, James felt truly vulnerable. The walk back to his desk felt longer than usual. James Harrington could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, the silent whispers of the station filtering through his mind. He was under scrutiny now, and worse. He knew that the complaint had come directly from Rachel Walker, the woman who had refused to be intimidated. As he sat down, the weight of Captain Reed's warning bore down on him like a heavy cloak. He stared blankly at the pile of paperwork in front of him. He'd done hundreds of stops like that before, some more aggressive than others, but never had he faced this level of consequence. Reed had made it clear, one more misstep, and his career would be over. Yet James couldn't shake the anger gnawing at his insides. That woman had walked away too easily. He could still feel the sting of her calm words, the way she had refused to give in to his authority. For the first time in years, James felt powerless. The hours dragged on. Sarah, his wife, texted him a few times, asking about dinner plans. But he ignored her. He had no appetite for conversation, especially with her. Their marriage had become little more than a hollow arrangement, sharing a home but not a life. When he thought of her now, all he felt was resentment. Then there was Claire Matthews. Just thinking about her caused a dull headache to form at the base of his skull. Their affair, which had once been exciting, was now another source of stress. Claire had become too demanding, too needy. She wanted more from him than he could give. More time, more attention, more promises. And with everything that had happened over the past few days, James didn't know how to handle her anymore. He looked at the clock. His shift was almost over, but the pit in his stomach wasn't going away. The thought of going home to Sarah made his skin crawl. Instead, he grabbed his phone and typed a quick message to Claire. "Need to see you. Now." The hotel was a rundown place on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where no one asked questions, and the faces of the people who passed through were quickly forgotten. James Harrington knew it well. It was where he met Claire Matthews whenever the stress became too much, whenever he needed to feel something other than the crushing weight of his failing life. Claire was already in the room when he arrived. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her legs crossed, tapping on her phone. When she looked up at him, there was a flicker of excitement in her eyes, but James didn't feel it anymore. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, rubbing his temples. "What's going on?" Claire asked, her voice light but concerned. "Work's a mess," James muttered, sinking into a chair by the window. He could see the city lights flickering in the distance. "I'm under a microscope. My new boss is looking for any reason to get rid of me." Claire stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're a good cop, James. They can't get rid of you that easily." James shrugged her off, standing and pacing the small room. "You don't get it. This woman I stopped. She's married to my boss, Captain Reed. She filed a complaint against me, and now he's out for blood." Claire's face tightened at the mention of Reed. "So what are you going to do?" James didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. Part of him wanted to leave the force, to start over somewhere else. But the reality was, he had nothing else. The job was all he knew. Without it, he was nobody. "We need to be careful," he finally said, his voice low. "If Reed finds out about us, I'm done. He's looking for a reason to take me down, and if this gets out—" He didn't finish the sentence. Claire nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She walked back to the bed and sat down again, this time quieter, more withdrawn. "Maybe we should take a break," she suggested softly. "Just for a little while, until things cool down." James looked at her, and for a moment he considered it. But the thought of being alone, of having no one to turn to, terrified him. His marriage was over in all but name, and Claire was the only thing keeping him from completely unraveling. "No," he said, shaking his head. "We're fine. We just need to be more careful." Claire didn't argue, but the tension between them hung heavy in the air. Their relationship, once passionate and carefree, was now a fragile thing, stretched thin by the secrets and lies they were both entangled in. The next few days at the station were agonizing. Captain Reed had made it clear that every move James made was being watched. The once confident swagger that James carried with him had disappeared, replaced by a constant awareness that his time might be running out. Every stop, every report was now scrutinized. He could feel it, the subtle shift in how his colleagues treated him. Detective Adam Fisher, a fellow officer with a reputation for integrity, had always been distant, but now there was a palpable tension between them. James couldn't escape the feeling that his life was unraveling. The stress of work and the mounting pressure from Claire were taking their toll on his mental state. He found himself snapping at Sarah more frequently, their conversations devolving into arguments over trivial things. He could feel her slipping away from him completely, and he didn't have the strength to stop it. One evening, after another argument with Sarah, James sat alone in his car outside their house. He didn't want to go inside. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at Claire's name. He hovered over it for a moment, debating whether to call her, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Something inside him was shifting. His desire to escape was no longer enough to mask the fear gnawing at him. His phone buzzed in his hand, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Captain Reed. "Meeting in my office tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp." James's heart sank. He knew what this meant. Reed had made it clear that he wasn't going to tolerate any further mistakes, and now it seemed like the reckoning was at hand. The next morning, James Harrington stood outside Captain Reed's office, the knot in his stomach tighter than ever. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. "Come in." James entered, finding Reed seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable. There was an air of finality in the room, as if this was the moment everything had been leading up to. "Have a seat," Reed said, gesturing to the chair across from him. James sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He could feel his pulse racing, the silence between them stretching longer than he could bear. Reed leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "Yesterday I received another report about you, a complaint from one of your colleagues, Detective Fisher." James's heart skipped a beat. Fisher? He hadn't expected this. "What kind of complaint?" Reed's gaze was steady, unflinching. "He's concerned about your judgment, Harrington. He says you've been distracted, that your stops have been reckless. He believes you're letting personal issues interfere with your work. James felt a surge of anger. Fisher had no right to question him like that, but deep down he knew it was true. He had been distracted by the complaint from Rachel Walker, by his deteriorating marriage, and by Claire. He was spiraling, and Fisher had seen it. Reed stood up, walking around the desk to stand in front of James. I told you I was watching you, and I meant it. But this goes beyond one complaint. You've lost focus, and it's affecting your performance. I can't have an officer on the street who can't keep his head straight. James opened his mouth to speak, but Reed held up a hand, silencing him. I'm not firing you, Reed said, his voice firm. Not yet, but I'm giving you one last chance. I have an opportunity for you, an undercover mission. If you take it, and if you succeed, we can put this behind us. But if you screw it up, there's no coming back. James blinked in surprise. An undercover mission? He hadn't expected that. What kind of mission? Reed sat back down, his expression serious. We're investigating a drug trafficking ring with ties to the police force. You'll be going undercover to gain their trust and gather evidence. It's dangerous, and if you make one wrong move, it could cost you your life. But it's the only way to redeem yourself. James sat in stunned silence. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. This was his last chance, his only shot at saving his career, and maybe even his life. He had no choice but to take it. I'll do it, he said quietly. Whatever it takes. Reed nodded, his face unreadable. Good. You'll be working with Detective Fisher on this. He's already embedded in the group. Follow his lead and don't make any mistakes. As James left Reed's office, the reality of what he had just agreed to began to sink in. He was walking into a dangerous world, one where a single misstep could be his last. But at this point, he had no other option. This was his last chance at redemption. The night air was thick with tension as James Harrington parked his car in a secluded lot near the edge of the city. His heart raced in his chest, and despite the cool breeze, sweat trickled down his back. He glanced at his watch. Detective Adam Fisher was late. James couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was a setup, that the captain was putting him in an impossible position to force him out. He lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply in an attempt to calm his nerves. A set of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. James flicked the cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot. As the car approached, the knot in his stomach tightened. This was it, the point of no return. The car came to a stop and Adam Fisher stepped out, his expression as unreadable as ever. He gave James a curt nod and motioned for him to get in. You ready for this? Fisher asked as soon as James slid into the passenger seat. James wasn't sure how to answer. His mind was spinning with thoughts of how this could go wrong, but he couldn't back out now. Yeah, he said, his voice rough. Let's get it done. Fisher didn't respond. He put the car in gear and drove toward the industrial part of the city, where crumbling warehouses lined the streets like forgotten sentinels. The drug trafficking ring they were about to infiltrate wasn't just dangerous, it was deeply connected, with ties to both the underworld and law enforcement. If James made one wrong move, it could all come crashing down. Fisher finally broke the silence as they approached the meeting point. Look, Harrington, this isn't like any other assignment. These guys don't trust anyone, especially not cops. You're going to have to earn their trust, and that means getting your hands dirty. James nodded, his jaw tight. He had no illusions about what he was walking into. He'd heard the rumors about Jake Collins, the man they were targeting. Collins was ruthless, and if he suspected for even a moment that James was a cop, it would be over. Fisher parked the car a block away from the warehouse, where the meeting was set to take place. He turned to James, his gaze cold and serious. Follow my lead and don't say more than you need to. If you screw this up, we're both dead. James swallowed hard and nodded. This was it. The warehouse loomed in front of them, its windows dark and its walls covered in graffiti. Inside, the faint hum of conversation echoed. James felt his pulse quicken as Fisher led the way to a side door, knocking twice in a specific pattern. After a tense moment, the door creaked open, and a large man with a scar running down the side of his face peered out. Who's this? The man asked, his gaze immediately narrowing in on James. Fisher kept his voice casual, but there was an underlying tension in his words. This is Harris, a new recruit. He's looking to make some real money. The man with the scar, Jake Collins, James realized, sized him up with a look that made James feel like he was being dissected. "You don't look like much," Collins said, his tone mocking. "You sure you're cut out for this?" James felt a surge of defensiveness rise in his chest, but he forced it down. This wasn't the time to let his temper get the better of him. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't," he replied, keeping his voice steady. Collins snorted, clearly unimpressed, but he stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, with crates stacked against the walls and a few men scattered around, all watching James and Fisher with interest. It was a world far removed from the one James had known as a cop, a world where power was measured by fear and loyalty was bought with blood. Fisher led them to a back room, where a group of men sat around a table, counting money and discussing shipments. Collins leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed. "If you want in, Harris," he said, "you've got to prove yourself." James didn't hesitate. "What do you need?" Collins' smile was cold and predatory. "We've got a delivery coming in tomorrow night. You're going to help make sure it goes smoothly." It was a simple enough task, but James knew that nothing in this world was ever as simple as it seemed. He would be walking a tightrope, one misstep, and it wouldn't just be his career on the line, it would be his life. Collins leaned in closer, his eyes gleaming with menace. "Don't screw this up." As James drove home that night, the reality of what he was doing began to sink in. He wasn't just infiltrating a drug ring, he was living a double life, one that could spiral out of control at any moment. He was trapped between two worlds, each with its own dangers, and on top of that, he had to keep up the appearance of normalcy at home. When he walked through the front door, the silence was suffocating. Sarah was sitting on the couch staring at the TV, but her gaze was distant. Their marriage had been dead for a while now, but this undercover mission had driven the final nail into the coffin. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice flat. "Work," James replied, avoiding eye contact. He didn't have the energy to lie convincingly anymore. Sarah didn't press the issue. She just nodded, her attention drifting back to the TV. The disconnect between them was palpable, and James felt a stab of guilt. He had once loved her, had once been excited about their future together, but that felt like a lifetime ago. Now they were just two people occupying the same space. He made his way to the bedroom, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind was consumed by thoughts of the upcoming delivery, of the dangerous men he was now working with, and of the weight of the lie he was living. Every day that passed, the noose seemed to tighten around his neck. In the darkness, James's phone buzzed. It was a message from Claire. "I miss you. Can we meet tomorrow?" James stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "Not tomorrow. Busy with work?" The truth was, James couldn't bear to see her. Everything in his life was spiraling, and Claire was just another reminder of the mess he had created. He needed to focus on the mission, on staying alive. Everything else would have to wait. The next night, James arrived at the meeting point early. His nerves were on edge, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. Adam Fisher was there too, keeping his distance, watching everything with a sharp eye. James didn't know if Fisher trusted him, but at this point, trust didn't matter. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. Collins showed up a few minutes later, accompanied by a group of men who looked like they'd seen their share of violence. They were all business. No small talk, no smiles. They handed James a gun and briefed him on his role for the night. He was to watch the perimeter while the others loaded the shipment. As the night wore on, the tension grew. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a potential threat. James's mind raced with thoughts of how this could go wrong, how one mistake could expose him. He was out of his depth, playing a game he didn't know the rules to. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. James' heart skipped a beat as the trucks approached. This was it, the moment where everything could either go smoothly or fall apart. The trucks pulled up, and the men began unloading crates. James kept his eyes on the surrounding area, trying to stay focused. But the weight of the gun in his hand reminded him of the precarious position he was in. He wasn't just a cop pretending to be a criminal. He was in the middle of a world where life and death were decided in an instant. For a moment, everything seemed to be going according to plan. But then a car pulled up on the other side of the lot. James tensed, his finger hovering over the trigger. He could feel the eyes of Collins and the others on him, waiting to see how he would handle the situation. The car door opened and a man stepped out. A man James didn't recognize. He exchanged a few words with Collins, but the conversation was too quiet for James to hear. The tension was palpable. Collins motioned for James to come over, his expression unreadable. "Harris, meet Rico. He's going to be working with us from now on." James nodded, trying to appear calm, but something about Rico set off alarm bells in his head. This was a new player in the game, and James didn't know what to make of him. The rest of the night passed without incident, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The delivery had gone smoothly, but the introduction of Rico had thrown him off balance. He didn't trust the man, and he wasn't sure why. As they finished loading the crates, Collins pulled James aside. "You did good tonight," he said, his tone gruff. "But don't get too comfortable. We've got a lot more work ahead of us." James nodded, his mind still racing. He had passed the first test, but there was no relief. He was in too deep now, and the stakes were only getting higher. The days that followed were a blur of tension and fear. James found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the moment when his cover would be blown. He was living a double life, and the line between his roles as a cop and a criminal was starting to blur. Captain Reed was in regular contact, checking in on his progress, but the conversations were brief and to the point. Reed was cold, distant, and James could tell that the captain was waiting for him to slip up. It was clear that this mission was a test, not just of James's loyalty, but of his ability to survive under pressure. At home, things continued to deteriorate. Sarah was growing more distant by the day, and their interactions were reduced to brief exchanges about mundane things. James knew that their marriage was over, but he didn't have the energy to deal with it. Not now. Not when everything else was falling apart. Claire, on the other hand, was becoming more persistent. She wanted to meet, to talk, to continue their affair, but James couldn't handle the stress. He ignored her calls, let her messages pile up unanswered. She didn't understand the danger he was in, and he didn't have the time or patience to explain it to her. As the pressure mounted, James felt like he was losing control. The mission was taking over his life, and he couldn't see a way out. He was trapped in a web of lies, and every day that passed, the noose seemed to tighten around his neck. A week into the mission, James Harrington could feel the weight of every decision he had made. His life felt like it was spiraling out of control. Each day, he sank deeper into the criminal world. He worked alongside Jake Collins and the others, trying to maintain the facade of loyalty while gathering enough evidence to bring them down. Every moment was a test of his resolve and a reminder of how close he was to losing everything. One evening, after a long day working on the street, James was called into another meeting by Collins. The meetings were becoming more frequent and more dangerous. As he walked into the dimly lit warehouse, the atmosphere felt different. Rico, the new guy, was there, sitting in the corner with his arms crossed, watching James with suspicion. Collins stood at the center of the room, speaking in low tones with a few of his most trusted men. He turned to James as soon as he entered. "We've got a big job tonight," Collins said, his voice gruff. "Something that'll test whether you're really one of us." James felt a chill run down his spine. He had managed to avoid getting too involved in the criminal activity up until this point, but now it seemed like he was being drawn deeper into the game. "What kind of job?" James asked, keeping his voice calm despite the rising tension. Collins grinned, his eyes gleaming with a hint of malice. "We're hitting one of the rival gangs tonight. We've got intel on a large stash of drugs they're keeping in a warehouse on the other side of the city. You're going to be in charge of making sure the shipment makes it back to us." James tried to mask his shock. This was far more than he had expected, and far more dangerous. If he messed this up, it wouldn't just be his life on the line. It could also blow the entire operation. "I'm ready," he lied, though his stomach churned with anxiety. Collins slapped him on the back. "That's what I like to hear. Rico's going with you to make sure everything goes smoothly." James's eyes flicked over to Rico, who hadn't stopped staring at him since he walked into the room. Rico's presence made everything worse. He didn't trust James, and James knew it. The thought of having him as a partner on this job made the entire thing feel like a setup. But there was no turning back now. The night air was thick with tension as James and Rico drove across the city, heading toward the warehouse where the rival gang was keeping their stash. Rico drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. James could feel the suspicion radiating off him like heat, and it made the entire situation more dangerous than it already was. When they arrived at the warehouse, the streets were eerily quiet. James stepped out of the car, his pulse pounding in his ears as he scanned the area. The plan was simple. Get in, grab the drugs, and get out. But things were never as simple as they seemed. Rico was the first to move, slipping into the shadows as they made their way toward the warehouse. James followed closely behind, his hand resting on the gun tucked into his waistband. Every step felt like a countdown to disaster. When they reached the entrance, Rico glanced at James, his eyes narrowed. "You first," he muttered. James nodded, pushing open the door with caution. Inside, the warehouse was dark, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the broken windows. The place reeked of gasoline and rust, and James could hear the faint sound of voices in the distance. The rival gang was here. They crept forward, moving between the stacks of crates that lined the warehouse floor. James's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the center of the building, where a group of men stood around a pile of boxes that were undoubtedly filled with drugs. Rico leaned in close to James, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll take them out, grab the stash, and get out of here. You ready?" James nodded, though his body was screaming at him to turn and run. This was it, the moment that could make or break everything. He gripped his gun tighter, preparing for the worst. Without warning, Rico stepped out from behind the crates and fired the first shot. Chaos erupted. The men around the boxes scrambled for cover, shouting orders and drawing their weapons. James ducked behind a stack of crates, firing blindly as the sounds of gunfire filled the air. The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire and shouts. James stayed low, his body moving on autopilot as he tried to stay alive. Rico, on the other hand, moved with precision, taking out one man after another with cold efficiency. As the gunfire died down, James slowly stood, his ears ringing from the noise. The men around the boxes were either dead or unconscious, and the drugs were sitting in plain sight. "Grab the stash!" Rico barked, wiping the blood from his face. James moved quickly, loading the boxes into a nearby van as Rico kept watch. His hands shook as he worked, the weight of the situation bearing down on him with every second. He wasn't a criminal, but tonight he had played the part all too well. When the last box was loaded, Rico gave him a nod. "Let's get out of here." James climbed into the driver's seat of the van, his hands slick with sweat as he started the engine. Rico sat in the passenger seat, silent as they sped away from the scene. The entire time, James's mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. He had crossed a line tonight, and there was no going back. When they returned to the warehouse, Collins was waiting for them. He grinned as they unloaded the van, clearly pleased with how the job had gone. "You did good tonight, Harris," Collins said, clapping James on the shoulder. "Maybe you're more useful than I thought." James forced a smile, though inside he felt sick. He had done what he needed to survive, but the cost was starting to become unbearable. He had blood on his hands now, literally, and the line between cop and criminal had blurred beyond recognition. As the others celebrated their success, James slipped away, needing a moment to clear his head. He stepped outside the warehouse, leaning against the wall as he tried to steady his breathing. His hands were still shaking, and he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He had agreed to infiltrate the gang and gather evidence, not become part of the violence. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Captain Reed. "Status update. Call me now." James stared at the message for a long moment before finally dialing Reed's number. The phone rang twice before Reed answered. "What's the situation?" Reed asked, his voice as cold and direct as ever. James swallowed hard, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. "The job went off without a hitch," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've got the stash. Collins seems to trust me now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Good. But don't get comfortable, Harrington. You're still under the microscope. One mistake, and this entire operation goes down in flames." James nodded, though Reed couldn't see him. "I understand. Keep gathering evidence. I want to know everything about their operation. How they move the drugs, who's involved, Where the money's going? And Harrington, watch your back. Rico doesn't trust you. James tensed at the mention of Rico. I know. Good. Stay focused. We're getting close. Reed hung up, leaving James alone in the darkness. The weight of the mission felt heavier than ever, but there was no turning back now. He was in too deep, and the only way out was to see it through to the end. As the days passed, the tension in James's life grew more unbearable. The heist had secured his place within Jake Collins' gang, but it had also pushed him further into the criminal world than he ever thought possible. He continued to gather evidence, documenting everything he could without raising suspicion. But the danger was always there, lurking in the background like a shadow he couldn't escape. At home, things were no better. Sarah had grown more distant, barely acknowledging his presence when he was around. Their marriage was hanging by a thread, and James knew that it was only a matter of time before it broke completely. The worst part, however, was Claire. She had been texting him constantly, desperate for attention, for reassurance that he still cared, but James couldn't handle the added pressure. He was already stretched too thin, and Claire was just another complication he didn't need. One evening, after a particularly tense day, Claire showed up at his doorstep. James hadn't expected her, and the sight of her standing there, her eyes filled with worry, only added to his stress. We need to talk, Claire said, her voice quiet but firm. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. Now's not a good time, Claire. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face for answers. What's going on with you, James? You've been distant, avoiding me. Did I do something wrong? James closed his eyes, the weight of the lies he had been living pressing down on him. It's not you, he said quietly. It's everything else. Work, Sarah, this. He vaguely to the space between them. It's all falling apart. Claire's face softened, and she reached out to touch his arm. I'm here for you, James. Whatever's going on, you don't have to go through it alone. But James shook his head, stepping back from her touch. I can't do this right now, Claire. I'm barely holding it together as it is. Her eyes filled with hurt, but she didn't push him further. She nodded slowly, stepping back from the door. Okay, but if you need me, you know where to find me. As she turned and walked away, James felt a pang of guilt twist in his gut. He had once found comfort in Claire's arms, but now all he felt was the weight of his own mistakes. A few nights later, James found himself back in the warehouse with Jake Collins and the rest of the gang. Things had been running smoothly since the heist, and Collins seemed to trust James more than ever. But Rico, he was still a problem. Every time James looked at him, he could feel Rico's suspicion burning through him. The tension between them finally came to a head that night. As they sat around the warehouse discussing the next job, Rico leaned in close to James, his voice low and menacing. I don't trust you, Harris. James tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun tucked into his waistband. I've done everything you've asked, he said, his voice steady but tense. Rico smirked, his eyes gleaming with suspicion. Yeah, but there's something about you that doesn't sit right with me. James could feel the weight of the room shift. The other men were watching now, waiting to see how this would play out. Before James could respond, Rico stood, pulling a gun from his waistband and pointing it directly at James's chest. You a cop, Harris? The question hit James like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, trying to find a way out of the situation without blowing his cover. I'm no cop, James said, keeping his voice calm even though his heart was pounding in his chest. But Rico wasn't convinced. He took a step closer, his finger hovering over the trigger. Prove it. James's mind raced. He had to think fast, or this was going to end badly. But before he could react, a voice cut through the tension. Put the gun down, Rico. Jake Collins stepped forward, his eyes locked on Rico. I trust Harris. He's one of us now. Rico hesitated for a moment, but eventually lowered the gun. The tension in the room eased slightly, but James knew that the danger hadn't passed. Rico didn't trust him, and it was only a matter of time before he found a way to expose him. As the night wore on, James stayed on edge, waiting for the moment when everything would come crashing down. He had narrowly escaped death tonight, but he knew that his luck wouldn't hold forever. The noose was tightening, and time was running out. It had been nearly a month since James Harrington had gone undercover, and the weight of the mission was suffocating. Every day felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. His nerves were shot, his sleep was restless, and his mind constantly raced with the fear of being discovered. Despite Jake Collins' apparent trust in him, Rico was a problem that wouldn't go away. The man's suspicion was relentless, and James knew it was only a matter of time before Rico found the proof he was looking for. James was in his car, parked in a dark corner of the city, when his phone buzzed with a message from Captain Reed. "Come to my office immediately." James felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He hadn't heard from Reed directly in days, and now the sudden summons couldn't mean anything good. He drove to the station in silence, mentally preparing himself for whatever news awaited him. When he entered Reed's office, the captain's expression was grim. Reed wasted no time in getting to the point. "We've got a problem," Reed said, his voice low and serious. "Rico doesn't trust you, and he's pushing to have you prove yourself in a way that we can't allow." James felt a wave of panic rising inside him. "What do you mean? What's he planning?" Reed leaned forward, his eyes hard. "There's a major job going down tomorrow night. Collins and his crew are planning to rob a cartel's drug depot, one of the biggest heists they've ever attempted. Rico wants you on the front line to prove your loyalty. But here's the catch. We can't let this heist happen. The cartel will retaliate, and the entire city could end up in a bloodbath." James swallowed hard. The stakes were higher than ever. If he went along with the heist, he'd be betraying everything he stood for as a cop. But if he refused, Rico would kill him on the spot. "What do you want me to do?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. Reed's voice was cold and firm. "We're going to let the heist play out up to a point, but my team will be in place to intervene. Your job is to keep Collins and Rico occupied long enough for us to move in and arrest everyone. It's dangerous, Harrington, but this is your last shot. If you pull this off, you're done with the mission, and we'll wrap this whole thing up." James nodded, though the fear was clawing at his insides. "I'll do it." Reed stood and placed a hand on James' shoulder. "This is it, Harrington. Don't screw it up." That night, James returned home to find Sarah sitting on the couch, her face expressionless as she watched TV. She barely glanced at him when he walked in, and James felt the familiar pang of guilt settle in his chest. He knew their marriage was over, but something about the finality of it all weighed on him more than he cared to admit. He sat down across from her, unsure of how to start the conversation. They hadn't spoken in days. Real conversation, anyway. Everything between them had been reduced to superficial exchanges about groceries, bills, and whose turn it was to clean the kitchen. The silence was suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah finally spoke, her voice low and tired. "I got the papers today." James felt his throat tighten. "Papers?" She turned to him, her eyes empty of the love that had once been there. "Divorce papers, James. I filed last week." He didn't respond right away, his mind struggling to process the reality of it. He had known this was coming, had expected it for months even, but hearing the words out loud made it real in a way that hit him like a punch to the gut. "Sarah, Don't," she interrupted, her voice cold. "It's too late for that." James looked down at his hands, unsure of what to say. Apologizing felt hollow. Making excuses would only make things worse. He had destroyed their marriage, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. Sarah stood up, grabbing her purse from the counter. "I'm staying at my sister's for a few days. I'll be back to pack my things." Without another word, she walked out the door, leaving James alone in the silence of their empty home. He sat there for a long time, staring at the door long after she had gone. Part of him wanted to go after her, to beg for forgiveness, but he knew that wasn't the answer. His life had been unraveling for a long time, and now there was no stopping it. All that was left was the mission. The following night, James stood with Jake Collins, Rico, and the rest of the crew outside the cartel's drug depot. The warehouse loomed in front of them like a dark fortress, its windows blacked out and its walls lined with barbed wire. Inside, millions of dollars worth of cocaine was waiting to be stolen. Collins was in high spirits, his eyes gleaming with excitement as he briefed the crew on the plan. "This is it, boys," he said, his voice full of confidence. "We get in, grab the stash, and get out. No mistakes, no loose ends." James tried to focus, but his mind was racing. He knew that Captain Reed's team was positioned nearby, ready to move in as soon as things got out of hand. But the longer he stood there, the more he realized just how dangerous this was. If the cartel showed up before Reed's team did, they would all be dead. As the crew moved in, James kept close to Collins, his eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of trouble. Rico was behind him, his gaze never leaving James. It was clear that Rico still didn't trust him, and James could feel the man's suspicion growing with every passing minute. They reached the loading dock, where the first of the crates was being loaded into the back of a truck. James felt his heart pounding in his chest as he glanced at Rico, who was standing off to the side watching him closely. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken challenge between them. Everything was going according to plan, until it wasn't. A loud crash echoed through the warehouse, and suddenly the sound of gunfire erupted from the far side of the building. James's heart stopped as he saw armed men storming the warehouse. The cartel had arrived. Chaos erupted. Collins shouted orders as the crew scrambled for cover, guns drawn as bullets flew through the air. James ducked behind a stack of crates, his pulse racing as he tried to stay calm. This was it, the moment everything came crashing down. In the midst of the chaos, James saw Rico advancing toward him, his gun raised and his face twisted with fury. "You set us up, didn't you?" Rico shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire. James didn't have time to think. He raised his own gun, aiming directly at Rico's chest. "Back off, Rico!" But Rico wasn't listening. He lunged at James, and the two men collided, crashing to the ground as they struggled for control of the gun. James fought with everything he had, knowing that if Rico got the upper hand, he was dead. Just as Rico wrestled the gun from James' grip, a shot rang out. Rico froze, his eyes wide with shock as he looked down at the bullet hole in his chest. He collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. James staggered to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked around. The cartel men were closing in, and the rest of the crew was pinned down, barely holding their own. James knew that Captain Reed's team had to move in now, or they were all finished. Just as James thought all hope was lost, the sound of sirens filled the air. Reed's team stormed the warehouse, their guns drawn as they moved in to take down both the cartel and Collins' crew. James watched as the police took control of the situation, arresting the cartel members and disarming Collins and his men. Collins looked at James, betrayal written all over his face. "You were working with them the whole time?" He spat, his voice filled with venom. James didn't respond. He couldn't. The guilt was too overwhelming, the weight of everything he had done crashing down on him all at once. As the chaos died down, James stood alone in the wreckage of the warehouse, his mind numb. The mission was over. Rico was dead. Collins and his crew were in custody, but the victory felt hollow. The lines between right and wrong had blurred beyond recognition, and James wasn't sure where he stood anymore. Captain Reed approached him, his expression grim but relieved. "You did it, Harrington. It's over." James nodded, though he didn't feel the relief that Reed seemed to expect. He had survived the mission, but he hadn't come out unscathed. The things he had seen, the choices he had made, those would stay with him forever. In the days that followed, James tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. He had completed the mission, and the department praised him for his bravery. But James couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something along the way, something he couldn't get back. Sarah finalized the divorce, and she moved out of their house without so much as a goodbye. James didn't try to stop her. He knew it was for the best. Claire reached out to him once asking if they could talk, but James ignored her. Their affair had been a mistake, one that he couldn't afford to continue. He needed to figure out who he was now, after everything that had happened. Captain Reed called him into his office one last time. "You did what had to be done," Reed said, his voice filled with finality. "And because of that, I'm giving you another chance. But this is your last one, Harrington. Don't waste it." James nodded, knowing that Reed's words were an unspoken warning. He had survived, but only just, and the man he had been before the mission was gone. As he left the office, James looked out at the city, the sun setting behind the skyline. He had a second chance, an opportunity to rebuild his life, to find a way to make peace with the choices he had made. But he also knew that the scars from this mission would never fully heal. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, James was ready to face it. Alone, but stronger. wiser. He had lost much, but he had gained something in return, a clarity about who he was and what he wanted from the life he still had ahead of him. The weeks following the raid passed in a blur for James Harrington. The department had hailed the operation as a success, and James was praised for his role in taking down Jake Collins and the drug trafficking network. His name was cleared, and for the first time in months, James didn't feel like he was being hunted. But beneath the surface, things weren't so simple. James had emerged from the mission alive, but the emotional and psychological toll weighed heavily on him. He had lost Rico in a moment of life and death, and he had betrayed Collins, a man who had trusted him despite the twisted world they both inhabited. And while James knew he had done the right thing, the guilt gnawed at him in the quiet moments, refusing to let go. He had been granted a second chance, but at what cost? Back at the station, Captain Reed continued to monitor him, though the tension between them had lessened. Reed respected James for getting the job done, but he hadn't forgotten the recklessness and poor judgment that had led to the mission in the first place. "You're a good cop, Harrington," Reed had told him after the dust had settled, "but don't think for a second that you can fall back into old habits. I'll be watching." James had nodded, fully aware that this was his last chance. There would be no more slip-ups. James returned to the force, but he wasn't the same cop he had been before. The job, once filled with a sense of power and control, now felt hollow. The authority that had once fueled his ego now felt like a burden. He had spent so long abusing that authority, using it to intimidate, to manipulate, to serve his own needs. Now all he wanted was to find a way to rebuild, to make things right, if that was even possible. One afternoon, Captain Reed called him into his office with a new assignment. "I'm putting you in charge of community outreach," Reed said, his expression serious. "We need to rebuild trust between the department and the people, especially in the neighborhoods that were hurt by the Collins case." James blinked in surprise. Community outreach wasn't what he had expected. It was a far cry from the high-stakes work he was used to. "You want me to run that?" Reed nodded. "You've been through hell, Harrington. You've seen what happens when cops lose the trust of the people they're supposed to protect. Now I want you to help us fix it. I think you're the right person for the job." James didn't argue. He knew Reed was right. His time undercover had given him a new perspective, one that he could use to make a real difference. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about responsibility. As he dove into his new role, James began working with community leaders, organizing events, and talking with people who had long felt abandoned or betrayed by the police. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of people who didn't trust him, who saw him as just another cop in a system that had failed them. But James was patient. He listened more than he talked, and slowly the walls started to come down. One day during an outreach event in one of the wealthier parts of the city, James spotted a familiar face, Rachel Walker. She was talking with a group of people, her demeanor as calm and composed as ever. When she saw James, her expression didn't change, but she excused herself from the conversation and walked over to him. "Officer Harrington," she said, her voice steady. "It's been a while." James nodded, the guilt of their last encounter hanging between them. He had never properly apologized for what he had done, for the way he had treated her during that traffic stop, for the racism he had allowed to guide his actions. "I owe you an apology," James said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "What I did that day, what I said, it was wrong. I let my own prejudice and anger control me, and I hurt you because of it. I'm sorry." Rachel studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "You're right. It was wrong. But I can see that you've changed, Officer Harrington. What matters now is what you do moving forward." Her words hit James like a wave. She wasn't absolving him of his past, but she was giving him a chance to prove that he had learned from it. And that was more than he had expected. "Thank you," James said, his voice sincere. "I won't let you down." Rachel nodded, and with that, she turned and walked away, leaving James standing in the middle of the event, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Back at home, James had settled into the quiet rhythm of life without Sarah. The divorce had been finalized, and while the process had been painful, James had come to accept it as part of the price he had paid for his mistakes. Sarah had moved on, and James had no choice but to do the same. He hadn't spoken to Claire in months. After the raid, he had severed all ties with her, knowing that their affair had been a mistake. He needed to rebuild his life, and that meant letting go of the things that had dragged him down. Claire had been a part of his downward spiral, and while he had once thought she was an escape, he now realized that she had only made things worse. In the evenings, James would sit alone in the quiet of his house, reflecting on everything that had happened. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He had a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Months later, the department held a ceremony to recognize the officers involved in the Collins case. James stood alongside his colleagues, listening as Captain Reed delivered a speech about the importance of integrity, accountability, and redemption. When Reed called James up to receive his commendation, James felt a strange mix of pride and humility. He accepted the award, but in his heart, he knew that it wasn't the recognition that mattered. What mattered was the work he had done since the mission, the connections he had made with the community, the trust he was slowly rebuilding, and the man he was becoming. As he stood on the stage, looking out at the faces of the people he had worked so hard to protect, James realized that this was just the beginning. The journey to redemption wasn't over. It never would be. It was something he would have to work for every day. But for the first time, he was ready for it. The city skyline glowed in the distance as James sat on the rooftop of his apartment building, watching the sunset. The colors bled together, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. He had come a long way since the mission, but the scars remained. The memories of what he had done, what he had been, would always be with him. But instead of letting them define him, James had decided to let them guide him. He had learned from his mistakes, and he was determined to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but James wasn't afraid anymore. He had faced his demons, and while they hadn't disappeared, they no longer controlled him. He was stronger now, wiser, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, James closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The journey wasn't over, but that was okay. He had time, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. James Harrington had come a long way from the man he once was. His journey had been filled with mistakes, heartbreak, and the weight of his own poor choices. But through it all, he had learned the most valuable lesson. Redemption is not a single act, but a lifetime of choices. And just as James had made the decision to rebuild his life, you too have the power to take control of your future. Every day is a new chance to make better choices, to grow, and to find your own path. If you found this story meaningful, and if you're on your own journey to learn, grow, and overcome, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel. Here we explore stories of personal growth, redemption, and transformation, because we believe everyone deserves a second chance. By subscribing, you'll never miss an inspiring story or an important life lesson. So join us and be part of a community that's committed to change, learning, and moving forward. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you can be the first to hear our latest stories. Thank you for watching.